Hey everyone, and welcome to the Kingdom Story Experience. If this is your first time to the Kingdom Story channel, we'd like to say hello and we're glad that you're here to walk with us. Well, if you've found this video, you probably want to know a little bit more about the biblical story. You may want to know about the specific passages that we're discussing. And today our scripture is going to come from Genesis 2. But in reality, what we're doing is we're looking at 30 stories from the Bible that paint the larger grand narrative of God working through his people. Today we start for the setting of our story. Like any good movie, any good book, there's a setting that happens, and we're gonna begin with Genesis 2. Some of you might be asking, why aren't we starting with Genesis 1? We do have a Genesis 1 lesson put together, and maybe that'll be something that I do in the future if that's something you want. But we believe that Genesis 1 and 2 are two creation stories that help us see two different sides of God. In Genesis 1, we see a God who speaks the world into creation, who is able by just his voice to be able to see the magnificence of creation come to reality. It's a very ordered creation story. It's a very priestly creation story. And Genesis 2 takes a much more intimate look at God, his relationship with humans, his relationship with creation, and his design for both us and for the creation story. And so the creation stories tell us who created this universe and all that is in it. It tells us the purpose that God has set for humans. And it can cause us to see, if we don't get some of these things right about the perspective of God as it's laid out in Genesis 2, our purposes and all that, if we don't get the setting right, then it can really cause us later on to warp certain scriptures, to see them from a slanted perspective where God may not be good. And just like any movie, when you have the setting, that's the way life was supposed to be. That was the way life God intended it to be. And then, as we'll see in our next video, something does go wrong. But this is what we're bringing to you in Genesis 2. You know, the Bible is not always clear cut and super understandable. Many times it isn't. That's just the reality of it. But there's so much mystery and gold to mine as we walk through the story. So the theme that we're going to have for today's lesson is vision. We have to have the right vision of God that I mentioned, the right vision of ourselves. As I mentioned before, having the right view of God can make all the difference in the world. It's true. Most people think my God is stingy, and these are most people outside of the church, but even within the church, most people believe that God is stingy, he's harsh, he's wrathful, and he's full of rules. But as we'll see in our story today, it's exactly the opposite. When we have a distorted lens through which we view God, through which we view the Bible and through which we view ourselves, it can lead to wild interpretations and meaningless talk that doesn't lead to life, love, and joy. And these are things that God desires of us and that we should all deeply experience. So we're going to jump into our story and see what it has to say about God and who God is and who we are. So as we walk through our story, I'm going to split it into different sections as we study Genesis chapter 2. And the first set of verses that we'll look at is verses 4 to 7 of chapter 2. In our first section, we see a barren world where there is no trees, no plants, none of that has sprouted up yet, and there was no one to take care of the land. We see God causes water to spring up from the depths of the earth and water the entire ground. And then we not only see here that God is creator, but that he is also provider and sustainer. God then forms Adam from the dust of the ground and breathes into him the breath of life. God is like an amazing artist where he forms Adam from the dust and the mud, almost like a potter on a potter's wheel. God, who is the bringer of life, breathes into Adam, and Adam becomes a living being. Imagine that. God and Adam face to face, and God breathes into him. And as soon as Adam's eyes open up, there's God, face to face, nose to nose. How incredibly powerful of a moment would that be? Not only for Adam, but for us. The love that was exchanged at that moment continues to ripple through time and space even today. The next section we'll look at is verses 8 to 15, where God creates the Garden of Eden and work. In this next section, we see that God creates the Garden of Eden in the east, where he places the man. And if you've ever wondered why men enjoy, for the most part, the outdoors, the wilderness, even the wild of business, this is why. We weren't created in the garden. We were formed in the wild frontier, and God then placed us in the garden. And it doesn't just mean the wild. I'm also talking about any frontier, discovery, danger, or risk in all its forms. Here, God gave us the privilege to work the land and to care for it. We see that work was part of the creation and something that was core to our existence, not only as men, but also as humankind as a whole. Work was meant to be a beautiful expression of how God created us to be. And it still is. But as we'll see in our next story, it isn't always great, unfortunately. We don't always find our calling, and work was meant to be good and fulfilling to our souls, and we get glimpses of that even now. In our next section, verses 16 and 17, we see that God creates commands and reveals the consequences. In this section, God gives the first two commands in the Bible. We saw in our last section that God placed two trees in the garden. One was the tree of life, and the other was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I always ask people, what is the first command in the Bible? So far, every time I've asked this question, no matter where I've asked it or who I've asked it to, the answer is always, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. However, that answer is incorrect. The first command that God gave in the Bible was to eat of every tree in the garden. In the literal Hebrew, the word eat is actually repeated. In the original language, they didn't have punctuation marks like we have today. So in order to have an emphasis, they would repeat a phrase or a word. And it's how they drove the point home. And so here, it should actually be read as eat of every tree in the garden. For God is like a lavish banquet host who wants his guests to eat to their fill, right? To be satisfied and not to feel like there isn't enough. There were probably hundreds, if not thousands, of trees in the garden that Adam could eat from. And there was only one tree that God told him not to eat from. We see that God is a generous God. We see that his command to eat of every tree precedes the command to not eat. As humans, we have a huge tendency to start with the negative and downplay the positive. Why do we always have to go after the one thing that we can't have when there are tons of things that we can have? Our next section is going to be verses 18 to 20, where God creates the animals and responsibility. In the next section, God gives Adam another privilege of being able to name the animals. God is not only creator, provider, generous, loving, and a life giver, he's also a delegator and someone who shares his power with his creation. He gives Adam the responsibility of naming all of the animals in creation. I mean, what does it mean to name something? When you have a pet or a child, you are the one who gets to name them. And there is a certain power and responsibility that comes with it. You are their owner. You are their parent, not anyone else. God was helping Adam take responsibility and live into the reality that Adam was to care for God's creation as a co-regent. But we also see that for Adam, there was no suitable helper for him. There was no companion. Presumably, the animals were coming to Adam two by two. He was seeing that everybody else had a partner, but there wasn't one for him. In our last section, we'll look at verses 21 to 25, where God creates the woman, where God creates Eve. God knows Adam's deep longing for a companion, so he puts Adam into a deep sleep. He takes a rib from his body and creates woman. We see that God didn't take a bone from Adam's foot so that she would be below him. We see that God didn't take a bone from Adam's head so that she would be above him. But he takes a bone from Adam's rib so that she could be beside him. Man and woman are meant to complement each other, to be in a divine dance of supporting and helping one another as they navigate life. Neither is meant to be above the other, but together they work for the flourishing of this creation and of humankind. I mean, we've seen so many different character traits of God in just one story, but this story sets the foundation for us to build upon what God has done and to remind us of the things of how things were supposed to be. It reminds us of what God intended when he created us and the world. God is creator. He is provider. He is the bringer of life. He sees our desires. He is king. He is a delegator. He is a risk taker. He is a protector. And above all, he is filled with love and compassion for his creation. So as we come to the end of this video, I have to just remind us that we have to get this perception right. We have to have a right vision of God. And so we have to challenge the perceptions that we currently hold of God and come to him as he has presented himself in this story. This is who God is. This is who God created us to be in relation to him. He has given us everything we need and tells us to eat of everything in the garden. I have a challenge for you. Today, I want you to spend some time looking at God's creation. Maybe not today, but very soon in the week ahead. Whether it be at a park or in a beach, at a forest, or at your home looking at your pet or a fly on the wall. Let's take some time to let our hearts receive the true character of God today. To allow our souls some time to breathe and receive the life-giving air that God provides. Until next time, I hope you continue to find your place in God's story.